Welcome to Eyes to the Sky, a presentation on the American balloon service of World War I. These are actual photographs of observation balloon companies. The soldiers in these companies performed the job of aerial reconnaissance. The real-time intelligence they obtained and immediately relayed was indispensable to the infantry and artillery regiments on the ground below. The officers who ascended in these balloons above the front lines were daring and courageous beyond belief, and in extreme situations, under the attack of enemy airplanes, they had to jump. Hello, I'm Charles B. Lutz, author of the novel Eyes to the Sky. In dramatic fashion, this historical novel tells the thrilling story of two lieutenants in the American Observation Balloon Service of World War I. In the book, we ascend with them into the skies above the front lines. We share in their inspiring experiences, and we discover the events that forged their destinies. The novel is based on actual events and the real-life heroes who lived them. After the United States declared war and joined the Allied cause, colorful posters were created to recruit volunteers to aid the fight. Men signed on and began training for combat with the American Expeditionary Forces, the AEF. Women also responded and built the necessary tools of war in factories and munitions plants. Notice in the upper left-hand corner of the Join the Air Service poster, an observation balloon is pictured, with the observer's basket dangling below it and a parachute floating back down to Earth. World War I pinnacled the use of manned observation balloons in modern warfare. This presents us with a very unique slice of American military history. The 8th Balloon Company is the focus of the novel. This photograph shows the size of the companies, over 100 soldiers. The 8th Company trained at Fort Omaha, Nebraska. The badges and patches worn on their uniforms featured a balloon and basket centered between a pair of wings. In February 1918, they were transported by steamship across the Atlantic. They were escorted through enemy-occupied waters by a fleet of British destroyers and disembarked at Liverpool, England. On March 3rd, they found themselves at the Balloon Training School in Marne, France. Notice the warm clothing the observers wore and needed as they ascended up into the cold and windy heights of the wild blue yonder, a mile high up into the sky. They used their field glasses, binoculars that is, to identify and map targets on the battlefield, which spread out for miles below and in front of them. They relayed pinpoint targeting instructions to artillery batteries on the ground via telephone. The 8 officers assigned to the company rotated duty in the basket. A ground crew of 40 men held on to stay ropes and steadied the balloon as it launched. An 11-ton four-wheel drive winch truck unreeled the steel cable to which the hydrogen gas-filled balloon was attached. Within minutes, the balloon achieved the desired altitude. It's no wonder that these observation balloons were called kite balloons. They measured 92 feet in length with a diameter of 32 feet. Their shell was made of rubberized cotton. Nearly 1,000 balloons were manufactured in the U.S. by the Goodyear Company. The balloons contained both air and hydrogen compartments. The hydrogen was extremely flammable. Non-flammable helium was known to science, but was not yet feasibly producible in the necessary quantities. It took 3 hours to completely fill a balloon from portable hydrogen generators in the field. Technically speaking, these were Caco Type R balloons, named for their designer, French engineer Lieutenant Albert Caco. As a point of interest, he later collaborated on the construction of Christ the Redeemer, the world-famous statue in Rio de Janeiro, completed in 1931. Their peers had a special nickname for the balloon observers. They called them balloonatics. The job took a special kind of courage, thought to be pure lunacy, to fly in a flammable balloon and be a sitting duck for enemy airplanes. especially once the enemy began using incendiary bullets. These bullets carried a flame, and when they struck the balloon just right, they would ignite the hydrogen and the balloon would explode and burn. The observers then had to trust to a primitive parachute for escape. It all seemed like a crazy thing for any sane person to do, but the daring balloonatics did it. Parachutes were being used for the first time in combat. All an observer had to do was make sure his cords weren't tangled and jump out of the basket. The tethers would pull the parachute from the cone-shaped canister mounted on the outside of the wicker basket, and away he went. Observers could do very little to defend themselves under direct attack. They had to escape by jumping. The observer in command would order the assisting officer to jump first. Here are some statistics published by the National World War I Museum. There were 35 American balloon companies, 5,866 ascensions, 35 burned balloons, 116 jumps by observers, and unfortunately, 1 casualty. The novel, Eyes to the Sky, details the events surrounding that tragic casualty. The novel's 2 main characters are Lieutenants Cleo Jepson Ross and Herbert Beecher Hudnut. For personal reasons, they are given pseudonyms in the book: Clive Gerald Royce and Herkimer Brandel Hudson, thus retaining their initials CJR and HBH. On May 5, 1918, First Lieutenant C.J. Ross was attached to the 8th balloon. He was 22 years old, from Titusville, Pennsylvania, attended Pennsylvania State College, studied dairy science, and was initially trained as an infantry officer. He was the son of a U.S. Postal Service worker. Ross made 3 ascensions in the 8th balloon at Toul, France. The first was on August 4. He and another observer were hauled down that day with 22 bullet holes in the balloon, which did not ignite. On August 11, they were hauled down with only 3 bullet holes in the balloon. On August 15, Ross and another observer jumped. Both men landed safely. The balloon did not burn, but it had 85 bullet holes and 1 large tear from anti-aircraft shrapnel. It was beyond repair, and a new balloon was brought in. Soon after, on August 21, my grandfather, 2nd Lieutenant H.B. Hudnut, was attached to the 8th balloon. Lieutenant Hudnut was 24 years old, hailed from Port Jervis, New York, and was a graduate of Princeton University with a degree in business. He was the son of a Presbyterian minister. He had no prior balloon training, save 1 ascension at the Les Val-d'Ogne Artillery Training School. Lieutenant Hudnut made successful ascensions at San Miel on September 18 and 19. His next ascension was with Lieutenant Ross on September 26, 1918, day 1 of the Meuse-Argonne offensive. Sadly and tragically, Lieutenant Ross lost his life in the service of his country that day. The Meuse-Argonne offensive would bring about the end of the war 47 days later, with the signing of the armistice on November 11, 1918. On September 26, day 1 of the offensive, the battle line stretched from the Meuse River to the Argonne Forest. The 8th balloon was stationed directly at the center of the 20-mile-wide front. 13 balloon companies were aloft, stationed 1 to 2 miles abreast. The 8th balloon was part of the 1st Army's V Corps, giving eyes to the 37th Infantry. Unbeknownst to Hudnut, his former artillery regiment, the 115th, was also serving with the 37th Division and was stationed just 2 miles away from the 8th balloon at the edge of a grove of trees near a farm. Their first objective was to take Montfaucon, an enemy fortified hill 5 miles distant from their starting position. The 8th balloon took to the sky at 5 a.m. that morning. Lieutenant Herbert Hudnut's diary tells the events that followed. He wrote, September 26, blackest of days. Ross claimed we had box seats at 1,100 meters for the greatest battle ever staged in the history of the world. Several times during the forenoon, it became necessary to haul down on account of the approach of enemy planes. At about 2:15, a Boche plane shot into us from the sun. We both yelled jump, and I cleared head first in a tangle. My parachute opened, and I saw the balloon explode and catch Ross's chute on fire. Then I realized the Boche had followed me down and was pumping at me, but the wind carried me safe and whirled me around. I was dizzy until I hit the trees, made a terrible landing but climbed out okay. Some Frenchies and Dick Hager landed me safe, gave me some whiskey, and helped me to Colonel Bacon's dugout. Captain Reeves took me back to the winch, and I took Ross to a hospital and went to bed, sick as a dog and utterly discouraged. Upon inspection of Hudnut's parachute, 12 bullet holes were found. He had parachuted precariously but safely back to Earth, at the mercy of the prevailing winds, with no control whatsoever over his trajectory. He landed in a grove of trees where his former artillery regiment was stationed, and surprisingly was rescued by his old familiar comrades. He had glimpsed the burning of Ross's parachute after it opened. He was taken to the 115th's headquarters before returning to his balloon company. He then took Ross's injured and lifeless body to a nearby field hospital. Thousands of soldiers on the ground turned their eyes to the sky and witnessed the tragedy. Lieutenant Ross was killed by his fall to earth from a height of 3,000 feet. The impact broke his neck. His parachute had caught burning debris from the balloon when it exploded above him. He was the only American balloonist killed in action in World War I. This photograph was published by the Akron Press, Akron, Ohio, on October 21, 1918, at the courtesy of the Ross family. The caption states it is the actual photograph of the fall of Lieutenant C.J. Ross's blazing balloon. The inset is a picture of Lieutenant Ross. It is both appropriate and honoring of Ross's memory to relay words spoken about him by his family and comrades. They testify that he was a young man who was involved in church and religious activities, whose acts were clean and consistent Christianity. He was well loved by all, soft-spoken, with an easy chuckle and a ready smile. The glory and courage of his death is unquestionable. He followed protocol as the officer in charge by ordering my grandfather, Lieutenant Hudnut, to jump first. Once Hudnut's parachute opened and cleared the basket, Ross jumped, but by then it was too late. His act of valor and flawless leadership under the intense pressure of attack effectively saved my grandfather's life, a fact that my family and I are profoundly aware of and grateful for. We hope Lieutenant Ross's character and memory will inspire many and never be forgotten. The Allies referred to the Germans as the Boche, slang for cabbage head. The plane that shot down the 8th balloon that afternoon was a Fokker D-7 German fighter plane, flown by a German lieutenant. He was not detected until it was too late. He had cut his engine and initiated a dive from an overhanging cloud, with the sun's glare directly behind him. At close range, he unloaded his machine gun's incendiary bullets into the balloon. The following morning, a burial service for Lieutenant Ross was conducted outside the field hospital at Blaircourt. There at his field gravesite, a group of French and American soldiers, including Lieutenant Hudnut, paid their respects. Taps was blown, but the bugler broke down with emotion as he played. A chaplain spoke briefly, and the party left in tears. The Stars and Stripes was the AEF's official newspaper, published for and by the soldiers of the AEF. Lieutenant Hudnut had served in the 115th Field Artillery with Grantland Rice, the famous American sports writer of the era, and they had become friends. Rice wrote this front-page article in the Stars and Stripes, France edition, October 11, 1918. It concerns Hudnut's rendezvous with the 115th and reads as follows. Balloon observer rejoins his outfit. Lieutenant finds old battery, but not in orthodox way. Lieutenant Herbert Hudnut, late of Princeton and New York, has rejoined his old outfit. He came over in May as an artillery officer, but in August he shook hands all around and went off to become a balloon observer. What became of him during the next exciting weeks, none of the old crowd knew, and what became of his wandering brigade, Lieutenant Hudnut had no notion. He thought it would be pleasant to drop in on them sometime during the war if he could ever find them. For himself, he was ordered to a balloon in the Argonne, and from that elevation he was studying the landscape on the German side of the battle line when a Boche plane emerged suddenly from a low-hanging cloud and made a dive for him. Lieutenant Hudnut and his balloonist grabbed the parachutes and jumped. The great balloon was soon nothing but a slowly sinking torch, and the lieutenant a much rattled observer collecting his wits in the high branches of a tree to which the wind had wafted him. As he started finally to climb to earth, and an American officer held up a helping hand, he heard that officer exclaim, "Well, how in hell did you get up our tree?" From the lowest crotch of it, Lieutenant Hudnut paused and surveyed the outfit below. He had landed in his old battery. There is no mention of Lieutenant Ross's death in the article. The AEF did not publicize casualties until after the family of the deceased had been notified. Hudnut had experienced a marvelous and unexpected reunion with his former regiment. Of the 2,775 artillery guns stationed along the front that day, the hand of Providence landed him among his friends in his old battery. His emotions were a mix of joy in seeing old comrades and grief in losing Lieutenant Ross. So often, bitter and sweet emotions are mixed in war. In 1955, Grantland Rice's autobiography was adapted into a radio broadcast titled War Clouds, World War I, The Grantland Rice Story. In it, Rice revealed how he coped with his bitter recollections of the Great War when he wrote, "I saw and experienced enough of the filth, suffering, and horror of war to realize it never can account for anything that a slice of good Christian faith can't outstrip every time." 14,246 American soldiers who gave their lives during the Meuse-Argonne campaign are buried at the American Cemetery in Romaine, France. The cemetery was completed in 1931. It became the final resting place of First Lieutenant Cleo Jepson Ross. In 1936, Herbert Hudnut was able to visit his former commanding officer's gravesite. It was a profoundly emotional experience for him. The actions of Lieutenant Ross had saved his life in battle. At the conclusion of the war, the balloon training school at Arcadia, California, was renamed Ross Field in honor of balloon officer First Lieutenant Cleo Jepson Ross and his sacrifice. It was decommissioned in the spring of 1919, but during its brief lifespan, some 200 balloon observers were trained there. The large white balloon hangars are visible in the photograph. Today, a strip mall and county park stand in its place. Regretfully, there are no reminders of Ross Field or the heroic soldier for whom it was named. In Ross's hometown of Titusville, Pennsylvania, however, the Veterans of Foreign Wars Hall bears his name and houses some of his memorabilia, including one of his uniforms. Lieutenant Ross was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross Medal posthumously. After the war, Herbert Beecher Hudnut was honorably discharged from military service. He married and worked a job in business. He and his wife raised 4 children. Hudnut was aware that his life had been spared in the war. He was deeply affected by the dramatic events he experienced surrounding Lieutenant Ross's death. All of this forever shaped the destiny of his life. During the war, Hudnut was known for his habits of drinking and playing poker for profit. He abandoned both after the war, giving preference to drinking tea and playing bridge. 10 years after the war, he became a Presbyterian minister just like his father before him. In October 1928, he was appointed First Lieutenant Chaplain in the Army Reserve, and he became the National Chaplain for American Balloon Corps veterans. He served for over a quarter of a century as the senior minister of a prominent church in Detroit. In 1966, he was invited to deliver the sermon for the 36th annual Easter sunrise service at Arlington National Cemetery. His friend and church member, Wilbur M. Brucker, extended the invitation. Brucker was formerly governor of the state of Michigan and Secretary of the Army under President Eisenhower. The service was held on Easter morning, April 10, 1966. Reverend Hudnut was retired and 72 years old at the time. It was a tremendous honor for which he was very proud and grateful. He lived to be 93, from 1894 until death from old age in 1987. The amphitheater at Arlington is a large circular colonnaded edifice. It seats 6,000 people. It was filled to capacity that Easter morning of 1966. NBC Radio broadcast the service live to a national audience. The recording is held in the archives of the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. Chaplain Hudnut's typed manuscript of the sermon is a family heirloom. He titled the sermon, "The Gospel of the Resurrection," and he concluded it with an anonymous reference to the death of his former balloon commander and comrade, Lieutenant Ross. A man wrote after the death of a mutual friend, "I do hope there is a heavenly hereafter. Otherwise, the loss of such a noble man is unbearably cruel, and the essence of religion only a light, good hope, and nothing more." Easter answers him. The gospel of the resurrection reassures him. Christ is risen. Hallelujah. At the National World War I Museum and Memorial in Kansas City, bricks were placed in memory of the two lieutenants. The lead brick is Cleo J. Ross's, which reads, First Lieutenant, 8th Balloon, Distinguished Service Cross, September 26, 1918. Directly beneath it is Herbert Hudnut's brick, 2nd Lieutenant, Field Artillery, 8th Balloon. This wonderful watercolor depicting a respite in the trenches was painted by Lieutenant Germain Debray. The caption reads, Lieutenant H.P. Hudnut is reading The Virginian, Lea Spargia, September 1918, with best regards to the reader. The famous novel, The Virginian, written by Owen Wister and published in 1902, was the first of its kind and gave rise to a brand new genre, the American Western. Lieutenant Debray went on to become an architect in France after the war. He and Hudnut remained lifelong friends. Here is a list of resources used for the presentation and the writing of the novel. In-person book signings are loads of fun. It would be a pleasure to schedule one for your organization. Schools, museums, libraries, churches, civic and military organizations, and more are wonderful venues. Please reach out to me through the book's website, email, or phone. To experience the complete story, I refer you to the inspiring novel, Eyes to the Sky. It's available in all the various formats and from several vendors. I sincerely thank you for joining me for today's presentation. God bless you, and God bless America. Welcome to Eyes to the Sky, a presentation